The wind was a living thing, a predator made of ice and fury that hunted the high slopes of the Wyoming mountains. It stripped the warmth from Clara's skin, scoured the tears from her cheeks before they could freeze, and screamed in her ears until all other sounds died. The world had been reduced to a churning vortex of white, a blinding emptiness that mirrored the one inside her. Trees were smudges of gray against a paler gray, their branches clawed and bare. The ground, buried deep beneath the snow, offered no stable footing, only a treacherous promise of falling. She stumbled, her worn leather boots sinking past the ankle with every agonizing step. Her lungs burned, each breath a shard of glass. How long had she been walking? A day? 2? Time had dissolved into a relentless cycle of placing one foot in front of the other, a desperate rhythm against the howling chaos. Her thoughts were becoming as thin and scattered as the snow itself, drifting in and out of focus. One moment, she was here, a wraith in a threadbare coat on a godforsaken mountain. The next, she was somewhere else entirely, a place of warm sunlight and laughter that felt more real than the cold gnawing at her bones. A flicker of memory, bright and painful, a man's kind eyes, the color of warm soil after a spring rain. Samuel. He was handing her a daisy, its yellow center a tiny sun. They were standing in front of the small homestead they had built with their own hands, the raw pine still smelling sweet and full of promise. The memory was so vivid she could almost feel the sun on her face, a phantom warmth that made the present winter even more cruel. Then, just as quickly, the image soured, replaced by the acrid smell of smoke and the splintering crash of a door. The daisy was gone. Samuel was gone. Clara's knees buckled. She fell forward, catching herself with the hands that felt like brittle wood. The cold was no longer just on her skin. It was inside her, a deep, invasive chill that was settling in her marrow. She knew, with a dull and distant certainty, that she was dying. The thought held no terror, only a profound weariness. She had been running for so long, not just from the man with the cruel hands and colder eyes, but from the ghosts that whispered her name in the lonely hours of the night. Perhaps here, in this unforgiving wilderness, they would finally fall silent. Her fingers, stiff and clumsy inside her thin gloves, fumbled at the pocket of her dress. They closed around a small, square object, its edges softened by time and touch. She pulled it out, her movements slow and thick as molasses. It was a photograph, torn nearly in half. The paper creased and faded. In the ghostly light of the storm, she could just make out the image of a swaddled infant, its face a pale, cherubic blur. Her baby, her boy. She turned it over, her thumb tracing the faint, spidery script scratched into the back with the tip of a knife long ago. Elijah James. A sound, not quite a sob, escaped her chapped lips. It was a name she had not dared to speak aloud in years, a sacred word she kept locked away in the deepest part of her heart. Clutching the photograph to her chest, she let her body surrender. She curled into the snow, the flakes blanketing her like a fresh linen shroud, and closed her eyes. The wind sang a final, mournful lullaby as the world faded to black. Eli Carson did not like the wind when it howled like a banshee. It spoke of nature's indifference, a raw power that could kill a man as easily as it could snap a dead branch from a pine. It also made the wood harder to find. He moved through the familiar forest with a practiced economy of motion, his broad shoulders hunched against the gale, his axe resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. He lived by the seasons, by the light of the sun and the moon. And he knew this storm was a bad one. It had come early and with a vengeance, promising to lock the mountains down for weeks. He needed more wood, enough to feed the stove that was the beating heart of his small, isolated cabin. He saw the splash of dark color against the snow from 50 yards away. It was out of place, a disruption in the seamless white landscape. His first thought was a deer, perhaps wounded by a wolf and finally succumbed to the elements. He approached with caution, his steps silent despite the crunch of his boots. It was not a deer. It was a person. A small, huddled shape already being erased by the falling snow. For a long moment, Eli stood perfectly still, the wind whipping his long, dark hair across his weathered face. His jaw was tight. A person meant trouble. It meant questions and complications and a breach of the quiet solitude he had cultivated for 5 long years. The nearest town, Bridger's Hollow, was a full day's ride in good weather. In this storm, it might as well be on the other side of the continent. Bringing someone there was impossible. Leaving them here was a death sentence. He let out a heavy sigh, his breath turning to a plume of white vapor. His conscience, a stubborn and inconvenient thing, would not let him walk away. He knelt beside the figure, brushing the snow from a pale, still face. A woman. She looked young, though hardship had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth. Her lips were blue, her skin the color of wax. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck, under the delicate line of her jaw, searching for the faint, thrumming whisper of life. He found it, a pulse so weak it was like the fluttering of a trapped moth. She was alive, barely. Without another thought, he holstered his axe, gathered her into his arms, and stood. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of rags and bones. As he lifted her, a small, torn photograph fell from her grasp and landed face up in the snow. He glanced down, his gaze catching on the image of the baby before he turned and began the arduous trek back to his cabin, his own ghosts stirring in the depths of his mind. The world returned to Clara in fragments of sensation, the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee, the scratch of a wool blanket against her cheek, the low, crackling hiss of a fire. She was warm, a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to be drawing the frost out of her very soul. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were heavy as stones. A voice, low and calm, cut through the fog in her mind. "Easy now, just lie still." Panic seized her, cold and sharp. A man's voice. Her eyes flew open. She was in a small room, the walls made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. The only light came from a stone fireplace where a healthy fire blazed and a single kerosene lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the ceiling. A man sat in a chair by the fire, his back to her. He was large but did not move with menace. He was methodically cleaning a rifle, his movements patient and sure. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and a sharp pain shot through her left arm. She looked down and saw that it had been cleaned and bandaged with a strip of clean linen. Her dress, torn and filthy, had been draped over a chair to dry. She was wearing a man's long woolen shirt that swallowed her small frame. She was in a stranger's bed, in a stranger's clothes, in a stranger's cabin. The man must have heard her gasp, because he stopped what he was doing and turned his head. His face was shadowed, but she could see a thick, dark beard and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, settled quiet. He was not young, but not old either. His face was a map of hard years lived under an open sky. "You're safe here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You were near frozen when I found you." Clara shrank back against the pillows, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Safe. The word was a foreign currency she no longer knew how to spend. The last man who had told her she was safe had been Marcus, and his promises had been the cruelest lies of all. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Name's Eli. You're in my cabin." He gestured vaguely at the room. "You've been sleeping for most of 2 days." He stood and walked to the stove, his boots making a soft thud on the wooden floor. He moved with a slight limp she hadn't noticed before. He poured steaming water from a kettle into a tin mug. "There are herbs in this. It'll help with the fever." He approached the bed slowly, as one might approach a frightened colt, He did not try to hand her the mug, but instead placed it on a small, unsteady table beside the bed. He kept a careful distance. His consideration was so alien that it only made her more suspicious. She watched him, her eyes wide and wary. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she had come from or where she was going. He simply returned to his chair and his rifle, leaving her to the silence and the warmth. Over the next few days, Clara drifted in a feverish haze. The past and present bled into one another, creating a terrifying tapestry of memory. The gentle crackle of the fire in Eli's cabin would suddenly become the roar of flames consuming her first home, the one she had shared with Samuel. She could smell the smoke, hear the wicked laughter of the outlaws who had ridden in at dusk, their face demonic in the firelight. She had been visiting a neighbor a mile down the creek, borrowing sugar, a simple errand that had saved her life and damned her to a lifetime of guilt. When she returned, all that was left was smoldering timber and a silence so profound it was a physical blow. Samuel and little Elijah, gone. Not just dead, but erased. Then, the crackle of the fire would shift again, becoming the sound of Marcus's heavy footsteps pacing the floor of their small, suffocating room in town. He had seemed like a savior at first, a respectable merchant who had offered a grieving widow shelter and a new start. He had courted her with solemn promises and gentle words. But the kindness was a mask. And once the wedding vows were spoken, it had fallen away to reveal the monster beneath. He saw her not as a wife, but as a tarnished possession, a fallen woman whose past was a stain on his reputation. His punishments were swift and brutal, his words sharper than any blade. He called her broken, useless, a vessel of sin he was tasked by God to cleanse. The memory of his voice made her flinch in her sleep, a low moan escaping her lips. During these fever dreams, she would wake in short, violent bursts. Sometimes she would be thrashing, tangled in the blankets, her throat raw from screams that never made a sound. Eli would be there, a steady, silent presence. He never touched her. He would simply speak her back to the present. "You're all right," he'd say, his voice calm and even. "It's just the storm outside. You're safe in here." Once she woke to find him gently dabbing her forehead with a cool, damp cloth. She recoiled with a cry, scrambling to the far side of the bed, her eyes wild with terror. "No, don't touch me! Please, Marcus, no more!" Eli froze, his hand suspended in the air. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light, then slowly lowered his hand. He backed away from the bed, his movements deliberate. "My name is Eli," he said softly. "No one here will harm you." He left the cloth and a small bowl of water on the table and retreated to his corner of the cabin. From that moment on, he was even more careful, moving with a quiet grace that seemed designed to make him as unobtrusive as possible. He would leave food and water for her where she could reach it, then turn his back or go outside to chop wood, giving her the illusion of being alone. By the light of the lamp, after she had fallen into a fitful sleep, Eli would open a worn, leather-bound journal. He sat at his small, sturdy table, dipped a pen into a pot of ink, and wrote, the scratching of the nib the only sound in the room besides the woman's troubled breathing. October 17th, 1888, he wrote. "The storm has not let up. It has buried the world. The woman I found is still here. She has a fever that comes and goes, and when it comes, she cries out names I do not know. Samuel, Elijah, and another, Marcus, a name she speaks with pure terror. She has not told me her own. She watches me like a hawk watches a snake, waiting for me to strike. There are bruises on her arms, old and new, and a look in her eyes I have seen before, in men who have been through the worst of the war, a haunted, hollowed-out look. I should ride to Bridger's Hollow when the snow clears. Let Sheriff Miller know she is here, but the thought of handing her over to strangers, of sending her back to whatever life put that fear in her eyes, does not sit right. For now, she is a ghost at my hearth, and I suppose a man who lives with his own ghosts has room for one more." He closed the book, the leather sighing softly. He looked over at the bed. In the flickering firelight, she looked impossibly fragile, like a bird with a broken wing. He felt a stir of something he had not felt in years, a protective instinct he thought had died with his wife and daughter. He banked the fire and settled into his chair for the night, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him, a silent guardian in the long, dark hours. Slowly, the fever broke, the nightmares receded, leaving behind a dull, persistent ache of sorrow. Clara began to heal. The cuts on her hands and face scabbed over, and the deep, throbbing pain in her arm lessened. Her strength returned in small increments. First, she was able to sit up on her own. Then, to stand and walk the few paces from the bed to the fireplace. Through it all, she remained silent. The silence was a shield, a fortress she had built around herself brick by painful brick. Words had become dangerous, promises were lies, and questions were traps. She watched Eli, studying his every move. He was a man of routine and solitude. He rose before the sun, made coffee, and went out to check his traps or chop wood. He ate his meals quickly and quietly. He read the same worn Bible every evening by the fire, his lips sometimes moving silently with the words. He never tried to force her to speak. He would simply state facts. There is stew on the stove. The storm is finally breaking. You will need warmer boots if you are to step outside. His patience was unnerving. It was a language she did not understand. Marcus had demanded answers, confessions, submissions. Samuel had filled the silence with easy laughter and gentle questions about her day. This man, Eli, seemed to require nothing. He simply existed, a quiet and solid presence in the small cabin that had become her entire world. She did not trust him. She did not have the capacity to trust anyone, but she was beginning to fear him less. One evening, nearly a week after he had found her, the silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The wind had finally died down, and the world outside the single window was a deep, star-filled indigo. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. Eli was mending a tear in his leather gloves, his large hands surprisingly nimble with the needle. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt a desperate need to break the quiet, to offer something, anything, in return for the life he had saved. She took a shaky breath. The name felt strange on her tongue, a relic from another life. "Clara," she whispered into the darkness. Eli stopped his work. He looked up, his dark eyes finding hers across the shadowy room. He waited. Her own eyes filled with tears, hot and sudden. The simple act of saying her own name had unlocked something deep inside her, a well of grief and fear so vast she felt she might drown in it. The plea came out as a broken, ragged whisper, the truest words she had ever spoken. "Don't leave me broken again." She did not wait for an answer. She could not bear to see pity or confusion or annoyance on his face. She curled onto her side, turning her back to him, and pulled the rough blanket over her head. A single tear escaped, then another, until she was shaking with silent, racking sobs, mourning for the girl she had been, the woman she had become, and the terrifying, uncertain future that lay ahead. In the quiet of the lonely cabin, with a stranger as her only witness, Clara finally began to weep for herself. After the night she wept, a fragile dawn broke not only in the sky, but also within the four walls of the cabin. The change was not in words, but in the air itself. When Clara woke, the exhaustion of her grief had settled into a quiet resolve. She folded the thick wool blanket with meticulous care, a small act of order in a life that had been consumed by chaos. Eli was already awake, stoking the fire, the line of his back a solid and reassuring presence. He did not look at her, yet she knew he was aware of her every movement. She began to speak, her voice at first a tentative thread of sound in the quiet cabin. She would offer a simple, good morning or a thank you when he placed a plate of biscuits and salted pork on the table. The words felt foreign in her mouth. Like stones, she had to learn to shape again. But with each one she uttered, a small piece of the wall around her heart crumbled away. She started to help with small chores, her body still weak and aching, but her spirit insistent. She would sweep the floor with a handmade broom, her movements slow and deliberate. She would wash their 2 plates and mugs in a basin of hot water, her gaze drifting constantly to the window, her eyes scanning the dense, snow-laden woods that pressed in on all sides. The forest was both her sanctuary and her prison, a place that hid her from the world and yet might at any moment reveal her to it. Every snap of a frozen branch, every shadow that shifted in the wind, sent a jolt of fear through her. She was a hunted animal, and she could not forget it. Eli observed her quiet industry with a patience that was as vast and silent as the mountains themselves. He kept his distance, never crowding her, never offering help unless it was clear she was struggling. His protection was a practical and consistent thing, woven into the rhythm of their days. He saw how she shivered when a draft slipped through the chinking near the door, and the next day he spent hours mixing mud and straw to seal the gaps. His hands blew with cold. He noticed her threadbare coat, its seams strained and its fabric thin, and one evening, while she slept, he took it and painstakingly mended the tears with thick, strong thread, reinforcing the collar against the wind. When he was done, he folded it and left it on the chair, never mentioning the work he had done. He simply provided. He built the fires that kept her warm, cooked the simple meals that gave her strength, and stood as a silent bulwark between her and the harsh wilderness outside. The snow continued to fall. Days bled into weeks, and the cabin became an island in a vast, white sea. The relentless storm trapped them, burying the world under a blanket of profound silence and forcing an emotional closeness neither of them had expected nor sought. The small space, which had at first felt like a cage to Clara, began to feel like a world unto itself, governed by its own quiet rules and rhythms. They moved around each other in a slow, practiced dance, a choreography of shared solitude. She learned the sound of his breathing when he slept, a low and steady rhythm. He learned that she hummed, almost inaudibly, when she was kneading dough for bread, a mournful, forgotten tune. The long evenings were the most potent. With the chores done and the storm raging outside, there was nothing to do but sit by the fire and exist in each other's presence. The silence, once a barrier, became a vessel, holding all the things they did not say. It was in this shared quiet, with the firelight casting a warm, golden glow on their faces, that the first real questions began to surface. One night, as Eli was oiling his rifle, his movements methodical and hypnotizing, Clara found the courage to ask, "Why are you here?" she said, her voice soft. "All alone, so far from everything." Eli stopped his work, his hands stilling on the cool metal of the barrel. He stared into the fire for a long time, the flames reflecting in his dark, somber eyes. She thought perhaps he would not answer, that she had overstepped some unspoken boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with memory. "I wasn't always alone," he began. "I had a wife. Her name was Sarah." He said the name as if it were a prayer, a sacred thing he had not spoken aloud in a very long time. She had hair the color of corn silk and a laugh that could make wildflowers grow. We had a small place down in the valley. Good land. We were happy. He paused, his throat working. Clara remained perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, her heart aching for the story he was telling. "We had a daughter," he continued, his voice even quieter now. "Lily, she was everything. Small and perfect, with her mother's eyes." He looked up from the fire, his gaze distant, seeing a world no one else could. The fever came in the spring of '83. It moved through the valley like a phantom, taking who it would. It took them both in less than a week. First Lily, then Sarah, who refused to leave her side. He fell silent again, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. I buried them myself, up on the hill overlooking the creek where Lily used to chase dragonflies. After that, the valley was too loud. The silence in our cabin was deafening, full of her laughter and the baby's cries. So I came up here. The mountains have their own kind of silence. It's an honest quiet. It doesn't pretend to be anything else. It matched what was inside me. He looked at Clara then, his eyes holding a profound and weary sadness that she recognized as a reflection of her own. I didn't mean to bury myself, he said, his voice barely a whisper. But I suppose I did. His confession hung in the air, a raw and honest offering. It was a gift of trust, and Clara knew she had to offer one in return. Her own story felt ugly and shameful next to his clean, tragic grief, but his vulnerability gave her a strange and desperate courage. I had a husband once, she started, her voice trembling slightly. Samuel. He was a good man, kind. We had a son, Elijah. She touched the pocket of her dress, where the torn photograph still rested. Outlaws. They burned our homestead. I was away when it happened. When I came back, they were gone. Everyone was gone. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to continue, to speak the part of the story she had never told anyone. I was alone, a widow with nothing. I went to town, and I met another man. His name was Marcus. She spat the name like a poison. He was a merchant, well respected. He offered me a home, security. I thought it was a blessing. I thought I could start again, but it was a trap. Her hands twisted in her lap, her knuckles white. He never saw me. He only saw a widow, a woman who had been touched by violence and tragedy. In his eyes, that made me unclean, fallen. The word felt like acid on her tongue. He said it was his duty to save my soul. His touch was not a husband's touch. It was a punishment. He told me the pain was cleansing me of my past, of the sin of surviving when my family had not. Every day, he would remind me how broken I was, how lucky I was that a man like him would take in such a damaged thing. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she did not wipe them away. She had to finish. He did things to make sure I remembered I belonged to him. The night I ran, he had told me he would never let me go, that I was his to fix or to break completely. I waited until he was asleep, and I just ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I would rather die out in the wilderness than let him break the last small piece of me that was still my own. She finished, her body trembling with the force of her confession. She sat in shame, unable to meet Eli's gaze, expecting to see disgust or pity in his eyes. She waited for him to turn away, to confirm what Marcus had told her for so long, that she was dirty, ruined, unworthy of kindness. But when she finally dared to look up, she saw neither pity nor judgment on his face. She saw a deep, quiet anger, an anger that was directed not at her, but at the man who had hurt her. Eli put down his rifle and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. His voice, when he spoke, was firm and clear, cutting through her shame like a knife. That shame is his to carry. Clara, not yours, he said. Surviving is not a sin. It's a victory. He did not break you. You are still here. His words were simple, but they landed in her soul with the force of a revelation. He did not try to comfort her with empty platitudes. He offered her something far more valuable, her dignity. He saw her not as a fallen woman, but as a survivor. In that moment, sitting in a remote cabin with a man she barely knew, Clara felt a flicker of the person she used to be, the woman before Samuel's death, before Marcus's cruelty. It was a fragile ember, but for the first time in years, it was there. After that night, the cabin felt different. The confessions had cleared the air, forging a bond that was deeper than words. An unspoken understanding now existed between them. They were two solitary souls who had been fractured by life, and in each other's presence. The broken pieces felt a little less sharp. The tension between them began to shift, evolving from a wary awareness into something more charged, more delicate. It manifested in small, fleeting moments. Their hands would brush when she passed him a mug of coffee, sending a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the heat of the drink. He would catch her eye from across the room, and for a long, breathless moment, they would simply look at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Sometimes, the silence would stretch for so long that she could hear her own heartbeat, a frantic, hopeful rhythm in the quiet. She began to see him not just as a rescuer, but as a man. She noticed the way the firelight caught the threads of silver at his temples, the network of fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. She saw the immense strength in his hands when he chopped wood, and the surprising gentleness in those same hands when he tended to a small bird with a broken wing that he had found near the door. She saw the profound loneliness in his eyes, a familiar ache that called to her own. The snow finally stopped, and after weeks of gray, oppressive skies, a brilliant, crystalline morning dawned. The sun, when it rose over the mountain peaks, was dazzling, setting the endless expanse of white ablaze with light. It poured through the cabin's small window, a tangible promise of warmth and life. Clara, feeling a surge of something she could not name, a wild, reckless joy, felt an overwhelming urge to be in it. She pulled on the woolen shirt and her dress, but did not stop to find her boots. She threw open the cabin door and stepped outside, onto the small, cleared porch. The air was so cold it was like a physical blow, stealing her breath, but it was clean and sharp and alive. Without thinking, she stepped off the porch, into the deep, powdery snow. The shock of the cold was instantaneous and brutal, a searing pain that shot up from the soles of her feet. She gasped, but she did not retreat. She stood there, her bare feet buried in the icy whiteness, and tilted her head back, letting the glorious, impossible sunlight wash over her face. For a single, perfect moment, she felt free. She was not a widow, not a victim, not a runaway. She was just a woman, feeling the sun on her skin for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The cabin door flew open. "Clara, what in God's name are you doing?" Eli was there, his face a mask of alarm. He did not wait for an answer. He moved with a speed and grace that startled her, crossing the porch in 2 long strides and plunging into the snow beside her. Without hesitation, he knelt before her, his own knees sinking into the drift. "Your feet," he said, his voice rough with concern. "You'll lose them to the frost." Before she could react, he took hold of her ankles and lifted her feet, one by one, out of the snow. He brushed the clinging ice and snow from her skin with his bare hands, his touch urgent and firm. Then, he did something that made the air leave her lungs in a rush. He cradled her bare feet in his large, calloused hands, bringing them to his chest and enclosing them completely. His hands were a furnace. The warmth that radiated from them was immediate and intense, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the snow. It was a warmth that went beyond skin, seeping into her, chasing away the chill that had lived in her bones for so long. It was the most intimate gesture she had ever known, more intimate than a kiss, more profound than an embrace. It was an act of pure, unselfish care. She looked down at him, at his dark head bent over her feet, his breath creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air. He was holding the most vulnerable parts of her in his hands, warming them, protecting them, asking for nothing in return. He looked up, his dark eyes locking with hers. The world seemed to fall away. There was no snow, no sun, no cold. There was only the feeling of his hands on her skin and the raw, unguarded look on his face. He saw her, truly saw her, and she saw him, a man so full of his own quiet pain, yet still capable of such profound tenderness. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. They remained there, frozen in a moment of stunning, unexpected intimacy, the silence between them charged with a new and terrifying electricity. They were both breathless, their hearts hammering in unison, caught in the sudden realization that something irrevocable had just passed between them, something as bright and dangerous and beautiful as the morning sun on the fresh snow. The moment in the snow hung between them, a fragile, unspoken thing. In the days that followed, the air in the cabin was thick with a new awareness, a quiet tension that was both terrifying and hopeful. They moved around each other with a heightened sense of care, as if they were handling something precious that might shatter at the slightest wrong move. But the fragile peace of their isolated world could not last. The wilderness demanded tribute, and their small cache of supplies was dwindling. The flour sack was nearly empty. The coffee was down to its last scoop, and the salt was a mere dusting at the bottom of its tin. Eli knew he could put it off no longer. He had to ride to Bridger's Hollow. "I need to go to town," he announced one morning, his voice carefully neutral as he pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat. "We're low on flour and salt, and I need to get some medicine. For your arm, to make sure it doesn't get infected." Clara's heart seized. The thought of him leaving, of being left alone in the vast, silent wilderness, was a cold fist of dread in her stomach. The cabin, which had become her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap once more. What if he did not come back? What if something happened to him? Or worse, what if he simply decided not to return, leaving her to fend for herself? The old fears, the ones that whispered of abandonment and betrayal, rose up in a suffocating wave. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched as he saddled his sturdy mare, her hands twisting in the folds of her dress. He moved with a grim efficiency, his face set in hard lines. He was not just going for supplies. He was re-entering a world he had long since abandoned, and he carried the dread of it on his broad shoulders. "I'll be back before nightfall tomorrow," he said, turning to face her. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the mask of stoicism slipped. She saw the conflict in them, the reluctance to leave her. "Bolt the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone. Keep the rifle loaded and close by." He pointed to the firearm resting on its pegs by the hearth. "You know how to use it?" "My first husband, Samuel, taught me," she whispered. He nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "Good. I'll be as quick as I can." He hesitated, his hand hovering in the air as if he wanted to reach for her, then let it drop to his side. With a final, lingering look, he swung himself into the saddle and rode away, disappearing into the dense stand of pine trees without looking back. The sound of his horse's hooves on the packed snow faded, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than any she had ever known. The journey to Bridger's Hollow was a hard one. The trail was narrow and slick with ice in places, but Eli pushed his mare onward, his mind a turbulent storm of thoughts. Leaving Clara alone felt like a betrayal of a silent promise he had made, not just to her, but to himself. He had taken responsibility for her, and the weight of it was a constant, pressing thing. He worried about her fear, about the ghosts that haunted her in the quiet hours, but he also worried about what he might find in town. News traveled, even to the remote corners of Wyoming, and a strange woman appearing out of a blizzard was the kind of story that tongues loved to wag. Bridger's Hollow was not so much a town as a raw collection of log buildings huddled in a narrow valley, a last outpost before the unforgiving climb into the mountains. It consisted of a trading post, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a handful of cabins. As Eli rode down the muddy main street, he felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. He was a known figure here, but not a welcome one. He was the man who had turned his back on the world, the recluse who lived with the ghosts of his past. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth, their greetings curt nods rather than friendly words. He tied his horse in front of Miller's trading post, the largest building in town, its windows crowded with everything from sacks of flour to traps and ammunition. The moment he stepped inside, the warm, stuffy air, thick with the smells of leather, tobacco, and dried goods, enveloped him. A handful of men were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, their voices a low drone of gossip. Just vanished into the storm. One of them was saying, "Sheriff figures the wolves got her," or she found a ravine. Either way, ain't no one surviving a night in that blizzard. Eli's blood ran cold. He kept his back to them, pretending to inspect a display of knives as he listened, his every muscle tensed. "Her husband seemed torn up about it," another man added with a sneer. "Torn up enough to offer a $50 reward for her return, or for news of her body." "Marcus Thorne," the first man said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the hot stove. "Axe the grieving husband, but I've heard things. Man's got a temper like a rattlesnake and a heavy hand to go with it. A few folks saw her with a black eye last fall." "Still," a third voice chimed in. $50 is $50. He says she was unwell, prone to wandering off, her mind not right since she lost her first family." Eli's hand tightened on the handle of a hunting knife until his knuckles were white. So her name was known. Her story, or at least a cruel, twisted version of it, was common knowledge. And her husband, Marcus, was here, in this very town, painting her as a madwoman and putting a price on her head. The news was a physical blow, leaving him winded and filled with a cold, protective rage. He had to get what he needed and leave, before his face or his questions gave anything away. He bought his supplies from Old Man Miller, his words clipped and his eyes hard, paid in cash, and left without another word, the gossip of the men following him out the door like a foul smell. Back at the cabin, the silence was a living entity. Clara bolted the door as Eli had instructed, the heavy wooden bar thudding into place with a sound of grim finality. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. Every creak of the logs settling, every gust of wind that moaned in the chimney, sounded like footsteps approaching. She kept the rifle on her lap, its cold, heavy weight a small and inadequate comfort. The day stretched on, an eternity of waiting, to keep her hands and mind busy. She cleaned the cabin with a ferocity she had not felt in years. She scrubbed the floors, washed the few dishes, and tidied Eli's sparse belongings. It was as she was dusting the small, sturdy table where he ate and worked that her hand brushed against the worn, leather-bound journal. She knew she should not. It was a private place for his thoughts, and to open it would be a violation of the fragile trust they had built. But the urge was a powerful, desperate thing. She was starving, not for food, but for understanding. She needed to know who this man was, this quiet, gentle stranger who had saved her life and listened to her ugliest secrets without flinching, with trembling fingers. She untied the leather thong and opened the book. His handwriting was strong and clear, the black ink stark against the yellowed pages. She found the entry from the day he had found her. October the 17th, 1888. "The storm has not let up. It has buried the world. The woman I found is still here. She watches me like a hawk watches a snake, waiting for me to strike. There are bruises on her arms, and a look in her eyes I have seen before, a haunted, hollowed-out look. I suppose a man who lives with his own ghosts has room for one more." Tears pricked her eyes. He had seen her, not as a burden, but as a fellow soul in pain. She turned the page, her heart pounding. She found an entry from a few nights later, the night she had told him her name. October 22nd, 1888. The fever broke. Tonight, she spoke her name, Clara. It is a good, strong name. Then she said something that will stay with me for a long time. Don't leave me broken again. It was not a request, but a prayer, as if she has only ever known men who break things. I do not know what tomorrow holds for her, or for me, but I will not be one of them. I cannot fix what is broken in her. Lord knows I cannot even fix what is broken in myself. But I will not be the one to cause her more pain. I swear it on the memory of my Sarah and Lily." Clara had to close her eyes, a sob catching in her throat. He had understood. He had heard the desperate plea beneath her words and had answered it in the privacy of his own heart. Her fingers shook as she turned to the most recent entry, written only a few mornings ago. November 10th, 1888. The sun came out today. Clara went out into it, with no shoes, like a child chasing a butterfly. She stood in the snow with her face turned up to the light, and for a moment she looked whole, free. I have never seen anything so brave or so beautiful. I see the strength in her. It is a quiet thing, like a river that runs deep beneath a frozen surface. She thinks she is broken, but I do not see brokenness. I see someone who has been bent but has refused to snap. I am beginning to fear I care for her more than I should. To care for someone is to have something to lose again. I do not know if I am strong enough for that. She closed the journal, her heart a wild, aching drum in her chest. He saw strength in her. He saw beauty. He, a man drowning in his own grief, was afraid of losing her. She pressed the cool leather to her cheek, the scent of him, of wood smoke and pine, clinging to the pages. The knowledge of his quiet, tender regard was a revelation, a gift so precious it made her ache. That night, alone in the vast silence, she slept a deep but troubled sleep. She dreamt she was standing in the field of daisies behind the homestead she had shared with Samuel. He was there, his face as clear and kind as she remembered it. He was smiling at her, but his eyes were filled with a profound sadness. "You are forgetting me, Clara," he said, his voice the gentle whisper of the wind. "No, Samuel, never!" she cried, reaching for him, but he remained just out of her grasp. "His hands are not my hands," Samuel said, his smile fading. "His heart is not my heart. It is right to live, my love, but do not let one man's shadow replace another's. Find your own light to stand in." The dream shifted, the field of daisies withering to ash. Marcus was there, his face twisted in a cruel sneer. "See," he hissed, his voice slithering into her ear. "Even your dead husband knows what you are. A broken thing, always looking for a man to hide behind. You cannot stand on your own." She woke with a gasp, the phantom touch of Marcus's cruelty making her skin crawl. The dream had shaken her to her core. It was a reflection of her own tormented heart, the guilt she felt for her budding feelings for Eli, the love she still held for the memory of Samuel, and the deep, abiding shame that Marcus had branded onto her soul. Eli returned late the next afternoon, his face grim and etched with weariness. The moment he walked through the door, Clara knew something was wrong. The relief she felt at his return was instantly replaced by a new, sharp anxiety. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened in town?" He did not evade the question. He set down the heavy sacks of supplies and looked at her, his eyes dark with a protective anger. "Your husband is in Bridger's Hollow," he said, his voice flat. "He is telling people you are not well in the head. He has offered a reward for your return." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had found her, or at least, he was close. The fragile sense of safety she had built in the cabin shattered into a million pieces. The wilderness was no longer a sanctuary. It was just a matter of time before Marcus's poison spread even to this remote place. That evening, they sat by the fire, the unspoken questions and fears a chasm between them. The news from town had changed everything, forcing them to confront a future they had both been avoiding. "What do you want to do, Clara?" Eli asked, his voice low. It was the first time he had asked her what she wanted, not just what she needed. "I don't know," she answered, her voice choked with honesty and despair. "I cannot go back to him. I would rather die, but I cannot stay here forever, hiding, waiting for him to find me. I have no money, no family, I have nothing." "You have a right to be safe," he said, his voice fierce. "A right to a life without fear." "And what about you?" she countered, her gaze searching his. "What do you want, Eli? Do you want to spend the rest of your days up here, Alone with your memories? He looked away, staring into the flames. I don't know, he admitted, his voice rough with an old pain. I never thought to ask myself that question. It was easier not to. They were two lost souls, adrift on a sea of uncertainty. The conversation stalled, leaving them in a silence that was heavier than ever before. Outside, the wind began to howl again, rattling the small window pane. Another storm was rolling in, a physical manifestation of the tempest in their hearts. As the night wore on, the temperature plummeted. A bitter, seeping cold crept through the log walls, making the warmth of the fire feel small and fragile. Clara, huddled in a blanket, began to tremble. A deep, uncontrollable shiver that came not just from the cold, but from the fear and emotional exhaustion of the day. Eli watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he stood up from his chair, walked over to the hearth where she sat on a small stool, and knelt in front of her. He took the edges of the thick wool blanket she was wrapped in and pulled them more tightly around her. Then, without a word, he put his arms around her, blanket and all, and held her. His embrace was not gentle. It was firm, solid, an anchor in the storm. She could feel the strength in his arms, the steady beat of his heart against her back. She leaned into him, her trembling slowly subsiding as his warmth seeped into her. It felt safe. For the first time since Samuel had died, she felt unequivocally safe. She turned her head, her cheek resting against the rough wool of his coat. She could smell the faint scent of the cold, clean air on him, mixed with the familiar smell of wood smoke. She looked up at his face, shadowed and stark in the firelight. The plea that had been a half-conscious whisper weeks ago now rose from the very depths of her soul. A conscious, desperate prayer. "Don't leave me broken again," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. He looked down at her, his dark eyes filled with a raw, aching tenderness. He slowly lowered his head, his gaze never leaving hers. And then he kissed her. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, as tentative as a prayer. His lips were chapped from the cold, but they were gentle. It was not a kiss of passion or of desperate hunger, but of profound recognition. It was the kiss of two lonely, grieving people who had found a flicker of warmth in the endless winter of their lives. It was desperate and sad and beautiful all at once, a promise of something real beginning in the ruins of their pasts. She kissed him back, pouring all her fear and hope and gratitude into the simple, fragile touch. For a moment, she allowed herself to drown in the feeling, to believe that this man's strength could be her shield, his arms her permanent sanctuary. But then, Samuel's sad eyes from her dream flashed in her mind, followed by the leering, triumphant face of Marcus. She was doing it again. She was running from her fear and hiding in the arms of a man. This kiss, as beautiful as it was born of a cold night and a terrified heart. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she gently pushed against his chest and pulled away. Eli looked at her, his face a mixture of confusion and hurt. "Clara?" She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Her next words were the bravest she had ever spoken. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "I want to, but I need to want it for myself, not just because I'm scared and you are kind. I will not be that woman again. Not for you, not for anyone." She was drawing a line, not in the dirt, but in her own soul. She was choosing herself, her own healing, over the immediate comfort he offered. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and in the space she had just created between them, the future felt more uncertain and more possible than ever before. The space Clara had created between them after the kiss was not an empty one. It was a silence filled with a new and profound respect. Eli did not press her, did not question her decision. He simply accepted it, his quiet gaze holding a depth of understanding that was more comforting than any embrace. Her choice, an assertion of her own will, had subtly shifted the dynamic between them. He no longer saw her merely as someone to be protected, but as an equal, a woman of formidable, if quiet, strength. As the last of the winter snows receded, the world outside the cabin began to awaken. The relentless white softened, shrinking away from the bases of the pines and revealing the damp, dark earth beneath. The sound of dripping water was a constant, gentle percussion, a count against the silence of the high country. Trails that had been buried for months re-emerged like faded scars on the land. With the thaw came the scent of pine and wet soil, the promise of new life. But it also brought a new and pressing danger. The open trails that offered them a path down the mountain were the same trails a man like Marcus could use to come up it. The wilderness was no longer a fortress. Clara felt the change in the air, a restlessness that matched the stirring of life outside. She could not hide forever. Hiding was a slow death, a surrender to the identity Marcus had tried to force upon her, that of a broken, shameful thing to be locked away. Her dream of Samuel's sad eyes, of his plea for her to find her own light, echoed in her waking thoughts. She had run from Marcus to save her life, but now she had to stop running to reclaim it. She found Eli by the creek, sharpening his axe on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone a steady and calming sound. She stood for a moment, gathering her courage, the cool spring air filling her lungs. "Eli," she said, her voice clear and firm, "I want to go to Bridger's Hollow." He stopped his work, his hand stilling on the axe handle. He looked at her, his expression carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in the set of his jaw. "It is not safe for you there," he stated, his voice a low rumble. "You know what he is saying. You know what they will think." "I know," she said, stepping closer. "I am not going there to hide. Eli, I am finished with hiding. I am going there to clear my name." The words, spoken aloud, felt solid and real, a foundation she could stand on. "Marcus took everything from me, my home, my safety, my dignity. He will not take my name. He will not be the one who gets to tell my story. I will—" He stood up, his height casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. He looked down at her, his eyes searching hers, filled with a deep and painful concern. "Clara, these are hard people. They thrive on gossip and judgment. They will not listen. They will whisper, and they will stare. The women will see you as a disgrace, and the men will look at you in ways that will make you feel dirty all over again. It will be cruel." "I have lived through cruel," she answered, her chin rising slightly. "I will not let their whispers be the final word on my life. I have to face them. I have to face him. Not with my fists, but with the truth. It is the only weapon I have left." He saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes, the quiet fire that had been banked for so long and was now beginning to burn brightly. He saw the woman who had survived a blizzard, who had faced down her own nightmares, and who had found the strength to say no to the comfort he offered because she needed to be whole on her own terms. He could not, would not, stand in her way. "All right," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. It was part fear, part pride. "I will take you." The journey down the mountain was the inverse of her desperate, stumbling flight months before. She was no longer running from something, but walking toward it. She sat astride a pack mule Eli owned, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Eli rode beside her on his mare, his rifle resting in its scabbard, his gaze constantly scanning the woods around them. He did not speak much, but his presence was a solid, comforting wall at her side. As they descended, the air grew warmer, the sounds of the world louder. When Bridger's Hollow finally came into view, a rough gash of civilization in the greening valley, Clara's heart began to pound a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. Riding into town was like stepping onto a stage. The moment they appeared at the end of the main street, a hush fell over the small settlement, A woman shaking a rug out of a doorway froze, her mouth agape. Two trappers loading pelts onto a wagon stopped their work to stare, their eyes lingering on Clara with a mixture of shock and crude assessment. Conversations in front of the saloon died, replaced by a low murmur that followed them like a swarm of insects. Clara kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, focusing on the space between the mule's ears. But she could feel the weight of their gazes. She felt them stripping away her dignity, dissecting her story with their hungry, judgmental eyes. The women's whispers were the worst. She could not make out the words, but she could feel their sting, sharp and venomous. They saw her as the woman from the gossip, the mad wife of Marcus Thorne, the strange creature brought down from the mountains by the town recluse. They saw a scandal, not a person. Eli led them to the only boarding house, a 2-story clapboard building with a sagging porch. The proprietor, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Gable with her hair pulled into a tight, unforgiving bun, met them at the door. Her eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed with suspicion. "We need 2 rooms for the night," Eli said, his voice even. Mrs. Gable looked from Eli's weathered face to Clara's pale one, a look of distinct disapproval crossing her features. "I heard she was dead," the woman said, her voice sharp and accusatory, as if Clara had personally inconvenienced her by surviving. "As you can see, she is not," Eli replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Her husband is in town," Mrs. Gable pressed, her arms crossed over her chest. "Mr. Thorne. He has been telling everyone a different story. He says you took her, that she is not in her right mind." She looked pointedly at Clara. "He says you are harboring a criminal, Mr. Carson, his own wife, who ran away from him." "We still need the rooms," Eli said, placing a few coins on the counter with a decisive clink. Mrs. Gable sniffed, but the sight of the money seemed to settle the matter. She begrudgingly gave them 2 keys to small, sparse rooms at the back of the house, warning them to cause no trouble. The room was small and stuffy, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto a muddy alley. The weight of the town's judgment felt as if it were pressing in on the very walls. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. Eli was right. This was harder than she could have imagined. To be seen not as a survivor, but as a spectacle, a piece of gossip, was a unique kind of violation. That night, the trouble they had been warned not to cause came looking for them. Clara was lying in the dark, sleep refusing to come, when a sudden, violent crash shattered the night. The window of her room exploded inward, sending shards of glass flying across the floor. She cried out, scrambling back against the headboard, her heart leaping into her throat. Eli's door was thrown open an instant later. He burst into her room, a pistol in his hand, his eyes wild and alert. "Clara, are you hurt?" "No," she whispered, her body trembling. "I am all right." He crossed the room in 2 strides, cautiously peering out the broken window into the dark, empty alley. He found the source of the attack lying amidst the glass on the floor, a heavy, jagged rock, but that was not all. The next morning, when they opened her door to face the day, they found the true message. Scrawled across the wooden door in thick, white chalk was a single, ugly word. Whore. Clara stared at it, the blood draining from her face. It was the name Marcus had called her in their bed, the word he had used to strip her of her humanity, to make her feel filthy and worthless. To see it here, a public declaration of her shame, was like being branded all over again. A wave of nausea and despair washed over her. Maybe Eli was right. Maybe this was a hopeless fight. But then, as she stood there, trembling and exposed, she felt Eli's hand close around hers. His grip was warm and strong, an anchor in the dizzying shame. She looked up at him. His face was a mask of cold fury. He did not look at the word on the door. He looked only at her. "We are not hiding from this," he said, his voice low and hard as granite. He gave her hand a firm squeeze. Come. He did not wait for an answer. Keeping her hand firmly in his, he led her out of the boarding house and into the main street. It was an act of pure, undiluted defiance. He was not walking beside her. He was walking with her. Their linked hands a public declaration for all to see. He was tying his reputation, his solitude, his very self to hers. The walk through town was the longest of Clara's life. Every person they passed stopped to stare. The whispers were louder now, more pointed. The leers from the men were more blatant, but this time it felt different. She was not alone. The warmth of Eli's hand was a shield, his steady presence beside her a silent testament to his belief in her. He met every hostile stare with one of his own, his gaze so cold and hard that people looked away. He walked with his head held high, forcing the town to see not a scandal, but a man standing with a woman he refused to let them break. Their destination was a small, unassuming building at the end of the street with a faded sign that read, Sheriff. Eli pushed the door open and led her inside. The office was cramped and smelled of stale coffee and dust. A pot-bellied stove stood in the corner, and wanted posters were tacked haphazardly to the walls. Behind a large, cluttered desk sat a man with a drooping gray mustache and weary, bloodshot eyes. He looked up from his paperwork, his expression souring as he recognized Eli. Carson, Sheriff Miller grunted. Did not figure I would see you down from your mountain this decade. What trouble are you bringing me? His eyes shifted to Clara, and a flicker of recognition, mixed with annoyance, crossed his face. I suppose you are the source of it. Clara felt her courage falter under his dismissive gaze. He had already judged her, but then she felt Eli's grip tighten on her hand, a silent message of support. She straightened her shoulders and stepped forward. Sheriff, she began, her voice shaking only slightly. My name is Clara. My husband, Marcus Thorne, is in this town, spreading lies about me. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, his expression unimpressed. Ma'am, a dispute between a husband and wife is a private matter. I am the law, not a marriage counselor. Mr. Thorne has already been in here. He has filed a report, says his wife, who is mentally unstable, ran off and was taken in by... He gestured vaguely at Eli. This man, he is worried for your safety. He is the one I am not safe from, Clara insisted, her voice gaining strength. He was abusive to me. I did not run away. I escaped. Last night, someone threw a rock through my window at the boarding house and wrote a vile name on my door. I am not the criminal here. I am the one asking for justice. I am asking for your protection. Sheriff Miller sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. He looked at her as if she were a persistent fly he wished would just go away. Do you have any proof of this abuse? Any witnesses? All I have is the word of a concerned, respectable merchant against the word of, well, a woman who disappeared into a blizzard and turned up weeks later with a man who lives like a hermit. It does not look good. Ma'am, my advice is to go back to your husband and sort this out quietly. Do not stir up any more trouble in my town. The dismissal, the casual injustice of it all, was a slap in the face. Despair began to creep back in, cold and bitter. It was hopeless. No one would listen. No one would believe her. I am her witness. The words, spoken in Eli's low, clear voice, cut through the heavy air of the office. Clara turned to look at him, her eyes wide with surprise. The sheriff, who had been about to dismiss them, stopped and looked at Eli, a flicker of genuine interest in his weary eyes. Eli stepped forward, releasing Clara's hand and placing his own on the edge of the sheriff's desk. He was no longer a silent shadow at her side. He was planting his feet and making his stand, risking the quiet, solitary peace he had guarded for so many years. I found her half dead in the snow, Eli said, his voice steady and unwavering, each word a carefully placed stone. She was beaten down and terrified of her own shadow. "Whatever that man Thorne told you is a lie. I will stand in front of any judge, and I will swear to the truth of what I saw. She is the victim here, Sheriff, and if you will not protect her, then you are failing at your job." Eli's stand in the sheriff's office sent a tremor through the town. Sheriff Miller, a man who preferred the path of least resistance, was now cornered. He had a respectable merchant on one side and his own town recluse, a man of few words but undeniable conviction, on the other. To avoid a formal complaint that would bring a territorial judge snooping around his jurisdiction, he settled on a compromise, a public town hearing. It was not a trial, he insisted, but a chance for both parties to air their grievances so he could make a decision and restore peace to Bridger's Hollow. The news spread like wildfire. A public spectacle was promised, a chance to see the mad wife, the grieving husband, and the mountain man all in one place. It was better than any traveling show. The confrontation Clara had been dreading came sooner than the hearing. As she and Eli walked back from the sheriff's office, a man stepped out of the saloon, blocking their path. He was handsome in a severe, well-kept way, dressed in a fine black coat that was out of place against the town's rough-hewn backdrop. His face was etched with lines of feigned concern, but his eyes, the color of chips of ice, held a cold, possessive light that made Clara's blood run cold. "Clara, my dear," Marcus Thorne said, his voice a smooth and practiced balm of condescension. He held his hands out as if to embrace her. "Thank God. I have been so worried. What has this man done to you?" Clara froze, her hand instinctively tightening on Eli's arm. Eli stepped slightly in front of her, his body a solid shield, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. "She is with me," Eli said, his voice a low warning. "Step aside, Thorne." Marcus ignored him, his cold eyes fixed on Clara. "My love, you have been unwell. You do not know what you are doing. This wilderness has confused you. Come home with me. Let me take care of you. We can forget this unfortunate episode." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "I know you have been through a great deal. It is no shame that your mind has been affected, but to allow yourself to be taken in by a man like this, to commit such a sin, it is a stain on your honor and on mine." He was doing it again, twisting the truth, painting her as a fragile, broken doll and himself as the noble, suffering husband. He was accusing her of adultery in the middle of the street, shaming her in front of the very people she had come to face. The humiliation was a hot, suffocating wave. "I am not going anywhere with you," Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. "And I am not unwell." Marcus's face hardened, the mask of concern momentarily slipping to reveal the raw anger beneath. "You see," he said to the onlookers, his voice rising with theatrical despair. "He has turned her against me. She is a pawn in his game. I am only trying to save my poor, lost wife." He reached for her then, his fingers curling into a claw, before he could touch her. Eli's arm shot out, his hand clamping around Marcus's wrist with the force of a steel trap. Marcus winced, his face contorting in pain and surprise. "Do not!" Eli snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Touch her!" He released Marcus's wrist with a shove. For a moment, the two men stood facing each other, a tableau of raw hatred. Then, Sheriff Miller appeared, pushing his way through the crowd. "That is enough. Settle this tonight at the town hall, not in my street." The hearing was held in the town hall, which also served as a church and a meeting place. The room was packed, every bench filled with the curious and the judgmental. The air was thick with the smells of damp wool, sweat, and anticipation. Clara sat on a simple wooden chair at the front of the room, with Eli seated directly behind her. Marcus sat at a separate table, a look of pious solemnity on his face, as if he were the one on trial. Sheriff Miller called the room to order, and the spectacle began. Marcus spoke first, his voice rich with feigned emotion. He spoke of his love for his troubled wife, of his grief over her first family's tragic death, and of the subsequent cloud that had settled over her mind. He described her as prone to fits of melancholy and delusion. He painted a picture of a devoted husband, desperately trying to care for a woman lost in her own sorrow. He ended by pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Eli, claiming the mountain man had preyed on her vulnerability, kidnapping her and filling her head with lies. The town seemed to sway with his words. He was a respectable merchant, a man of means and standing. His story was plausible, even sympathetic. Clara could feel the weight of their judgment settling upon her, a heavy shroud of disbelief. Then it was her turn. The sheriff called her name, and a hush fell over the room. She felt Eli's hand briefly squeeze her shoulder, a silent message of strength. She stood and walked to the center of the room, her legs unsteady but her resolve a hard, solid core inside her. She did not look at Marcus. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the stern, unforgiving women, the leering men, the few who held a flicker of curiosity rather than outright condemnation. She took a deep breath. "My name is Clara," she began, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "Mr. Thorne is right about one thing. I have been through a great deal. I lost a husband and a child I loved more than life itself. I was left with nothing. When he offered me marriage, I thought it was an act of kindness. I believed I was being given a second chance at a life." Her voice grew stronger, shedding its tremor as she found her footing in the truth. "But it was not a life. It was a prison. It was not kindness. It was control. He did not see a wife to be cherished. He saw a broken thing to be owned. He told me I was a fallen woman, that my survival was a sin he had to beat out of me. He called my grief a sickness and my tears a weakness. The bruises he left on my skin were, he said, a testament to his love, a husband's righteous effort to save his wife's soul." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. She pressed on, her words coming faster now, a torrent of pain and truth held back for too long. "I lived in fear, not of the memory of my past, but of the man who shared my bed. I was not unwell. I was terrified. I did not run away in a fit of madness. I ran away to save myself. I chose a blizzard in the mountains over the cold and brutal certainty of his home, because I believe I have a right to survive. I believe every woman in this room has that right. The right to be safe, the right to be heard, the right to not be broken by the hands of a man who promised to protect her." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "He did not just hurt my body. He tried to poison my soul. He tried to make me believe I was worthless, that I deserved the pain. The greatest shame I carry is not what he did to me, but that for a time, I almost believed him." As she finished, a profound silence filled the room. Then, something extraordinary happened. Near the back, an older woman, a rancher's wife known for her stern demeanor, slowly rose to her feet. She did not speak. She simply stood, her eyes fixed on Clara with a look of grim understanding. A moment later, another woman, the blacksmith's wife, also stood. Then a third. It was not a wave of support, but a quiet, powerful current. A few women, brave and weary, standing in silent solidarity, a testament to secrets kept and pains endured in the quiet corners of their own lives. The room was no longer a solid wall of judgment. It was fractured, split between those who saw a sinner and those who were beginning to see a survivor. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. He called Eli to speak. Eli rose and walked to the front, his limp more pronounced under the scrutiny of so many eyes. He was not a man of words, and it showed. He stood awkwardly, his large hands clasped in front of him. "I am not a man who meddles in town business," he began, his voice low and steady. "I keep to myself, but I cannot stay silent on this." He looked directly at the sheriff. "I found Clara in a snowdrift at the edge of my land. She was half frozen and barely breathing. If I had been an hour later, she would be dead. He turned his gaze to the crowd, his eyes finding the faces of the men he had known his whole life. I carried her back to my cabin. For days, she was lost in a fever. She cried out in her sleep, terrified, not of the storm, not of me, but of him. He nodded toward Marcus. I have seen fear in my life. I have seen it in cornered animals and in dying men, but I have never seen a fear as deep as the one she carried. It was the fear of a soul that had been hunted. He paused, his throat working. His next words were quieter, filled with a raw and difficult honesty. This woman, you look at her and you see a problem. You see trouble, but you do not see her strength. I have seen her fight her way back from the edge of death. I have seen her face down nightmares that would break most men. I have seen her choose to walk into this room and speak the truth, knowing you would all judge her for it. His voice cracked, shaking with a vulnerability that stunned the room into silence. He looked at Clara, and in that moment, it felt as if they were the only two people in the world. She did not just save her own life, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She saved me too. I was a man buried in his own grief, content to let the world pass me by. She reminded me that a life is something you have to fight for. She is not broken. She is the bravest person I have ever known. The confession hung in the air, a testament so pure and powerful that it seemed to suck the very breath from the room. It was not just a defense of Clara. It was a declaration. Sheriff Miller looked from Eli's raw, honest face to Marcus's tightening, furious one. He looked at the women still standing in silent support. He was a politician as much as a lawman, and he could feel the tide of the room, however slightly, turning. He banged his gavel on the desk. "This is not a court of law," he announced, his voice booming. "But I am the law in this town, and my job is to keep the peace, Mr. Thorne. Your presence here is a disruption. I have heard enough to believe that this woman is not with you of her own free will. I am ordering you to leave Bridger's Hollow by sunrise. If you are seen in this valley again, I will have you arrested for trespassing and inciting trouble." A gasp went through the crowd. Marcus shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "You cannot do this! She is my wife! The law is on my side!" "The law in this town is what I say it is," the sheriff retorted, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Now, get out." He then turned his hard gaze on Clara. "And you, ma'am, you have had your say. I advise you not to stir up any more trouble." It was not justice. Not really. It was an expulsion, a temporary victory that left the larger wounds unhealed. But it was something. It was a reprieve. That night, the adrenaline of the hearing faded, leaving Clara feeling hollowed out and raw. She had won, but the cost was immense. She had stood before her community and stripped her soul bare, offering up her most painful secrets for their consumption. She felt exposed, contaminated by their stares, by Marcus's lies, by the ugly words still ghosting on her door. She fled the stuffy room of the boarding house, needing air. She found herself in the muddy alley behind the building, the same place the rock had been thrown from. She leaned against the rough wooden wall, wrapped her arms around herself, and finally let the tears come. They were not tears of relief, but of humiliation. She did not hear Eli approach, but she felt his presence beside her, a familiar warmth in the cool night air. He stood in silence for a long moment, simply letting her cry. "I feel so dirty," she whispered, her voice a ragged, broken thing. "I feel like I let them all see the ugliest parts of me. I let them all see my shame." Eli moved in front of her, his large frame blocking out the rest of the world. He gently took her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. His touch was incredibly tender. "There is no shame in the truth, Clara," he said, his voice low and fierce. "There is no shame in surviving. You did not show them your weakness tonight. You showed them a strength they could never understand." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers, his gaze intense and unwavering. "You are the bravest person I have ever known." He kissed her then, not with the desperate, questioning softness of their first kiss by the fire, but with a deep, cleansing certainty. It was a kiss without shame, without fear. It was a kiss that sought to erase the ugly word on the door, to silence the whispers, to reclaim her from the memory of every unwanted touch she had ever endured. It was a kiss that said, "You are not dirty. You are not broken. You are mine to cherish." She kissed him back with a ferocity that matched his, her hands coming up to clutch his shirt. It was a kiss of absolute surrender, not to him, but to the possibility of a future, to the feeling of being wanted for herself, not in spite of her scars, but because of the strength it took to earn them. He lifted her into his arms and carried her back to her room, bolting the door behind them. In the soft moonlight filtering through the broken window, they came together. It was a slow, tender exploration at first, a mapping of each other's scars, both visible and invisible. His hands were reverent, learning the lines of her body, teaching her that a man's touch could be a comfort, a prayer. Her touch was hesitant at first, then grew in confidence as she discovered the hard, lonely landscape of his body, the deep well of tenderness he held within him. Then, the tenderness was joined by a fierce, desperate passion, a need to erase all the pain and loneliness they had ever known. It was a passionate claiming, a silent vow to heal each other's wounds, to fill the empty spaces grief had carved inside them. They made love as if they were trying to forge a new world in the ruins of the old, a world where two broken people could, for the first time, feel completely and utterly whole. The morning after they first came together, a new light seemed to filter through the dusty windows of Bridger's Hollow. It was not the harsh, interrogating light of public scrutiny, but a softer, more hopeful glow. The town had not magically changed. The whispers did not entirely cease, and the stares did not completely vanish. But Marcus Thorne was gone, a foul presence purged from the valley, and in his absence, a fragile space was created, a space in which a new life could, perhaps, take root. Weeks turned into a quiet rhythm of shared days and peaceful nights. They did not return to the isolation of the mountain cabin, but stayed in the boarding house, a silent, daily declaration that they were a part of this town now, for better or worse. Clara, needing a purpose beyond her own survival, approached the town preacher about the children who ran wild in the streets, their parents too busy scratching out a living to provide them with any formal schooling. The preacher, a kind man who had witnessed her testimony at the hearing, offered her the use of the church hall. And so, Clara became a teacher. At first, only a few children came, the sons and daughters of the women who had stood for her, their attendance a quiet act of continued solidarity. But Clara possessed a gentle patience and a deep well of kindness that the children responded to. She taught them their letters and their numbers, but she also taught them to be gentle with one another. She read to them from the few books she could find, her voice a soft and steady comfort in the echoing hall. Slowly, more children began to appear at the door, drawn by the stories of the woman who did not raise her voice and who always had a small, sad smile that made you want to please her. Through the children, she began to earn a new name in the town, not the mad wife or the fallen woman, but simply the teacher. It was a title she wore with a quiet, profound pride. Eli, in turn, left his life as a recluse behind, the solitude of the mountains, which had once been a balm for his grief, now felt empty without Clara. To provide for them, he took a job at the lumber mill just outside of town. It was hard, grueling work that stretched his muscles and tested his endurance. He would come home at dusk, his hair and clothes covered in a fine layer of sawdust that smelled of fresh pine, his face etched with exhaustion. But when he saw Clara waiting for him on the porch of the boarding house, a smile would transform his weary features. It was a smile just for her, a private, intimate thing that spoke of a deep and abiding contentment he had thought he would never feel again. He was no longer a man living with ghosts. He was a man building a life. Their evenings were their sanctuary. They would eat their simple meal together, sharing the small stories of their day. A child who had finally learned to write his name, a close call with a falling log at the mill. Afterwards, they would sit in comfortable silence, her hand resting in his, the horrors of their pasts receding into a distant haze, in the dark, in the privacy of their small room. Their bodies spoke a language of healing and of love, a tender and fierce reaffirmation of the bond that had saved them both. But the soil of a small town holds the roots of old prejudices deep, and not every weed had been pulled. A woman named Beatrice Miller, the sheriff's wife and the self-appointed guardian of the town's morality, had never forgiven Clara for the trouble she had brought. Beatrice saw Clara's quiet dignity as arrogance and her position as the teacher a disgrace to the community. She saw a sinner who had been publicly defended and, in her eyes, unjustly absolved. Beatrice began a quiet campaign of whispers, planting seeds of doubt among the other women. Was it right, she would ask over tea, for a woman of such questionable character to be shaping the minds of their precious children? A woman who had abandoned her husband, shacked up with a mountain man, and aired her dirty laundry for all the world to see. The poison found fertile ground in the hearts of those who preferred judgment to grace. The confrontation came one afternoon, just as Clara was dismissing her students. Beatrice Miller stood at the back of the church hall, her arms crossed, her face a mask of righteous indignation. With her were two other women, their expressions a mixture of nervousness and stern disapproval. "Mrs. Thorne," Beatrice began, her voice sharp and carrying, causing the remaining children to stop and stare. "We need to have a word with you." Clara felt a familiar cold dread, but it was shallower this time, without the power to freeze her. She calmly dismissed the last of the children and turned to face the women. "My name is Clara Carson now," she said, her voice even. The name felt new and strong in her mouth, a shield and a statement. Eli had insisted upon it, a public claiming of her as his own. Beatrice's lips thinned. "That does not change who you are or what you have done. We are not comfortable with you teaching our children. You are not a fit example. We want you to leave the school." In the past, such an attack would have sent her fleeing inward, her shame a suffocating blanket. But the woman who stood in the church hall was not the same one who had collapsed in the snow. She had stood before this entire town and spoken her truth. She would not be silenced now by the bitter whispers of a few. "What is it about me that you find so unfit, Mrs. Miller?" Clara asked, her voice quiet but firm, holding no trace of fear. "Your history," Beatrice retorted. "It is a scandal. We cannot have a woman of your reputation influencing our young ones." Clara took a step forward, her gaze not angry, but steady and clear. "My history is one of surviving things that would have broken many. Is that a lesson you do not want your children to learn? That strength is not the absence of scars, but the courage to live with them. You speak of my reputation, but you know nothing of my character. You see a scandal, but the parents of these children see a woman who is teaching their sons and daughters to read and to be kind. You are not worried about the children, Mrs. Miller. You are simply uncomfortable with a woman who does not fit into the neat little box you have built for her." Just then, the blacksmith's wife, one of the women who had stood for her at the hearing, walked in to collect her young son. She took in the scene, her eyes moving from Beatrice's furious face to Clara's calm one. "Is there a problem here, Beatrice?" she asked, her tone firm. "We are simply expressing our concern," Beatrice said stiffly. "Well, you can keep your concern to yourself," the blacksmith's wife said, placing a protective hand on her son's shoulder. "My boy has learned more from Miss Clara in 2 months than he learned in his whole life before. She is a good teacher and a good woman, and we are lucky to have her. If you do not wish for your children to be taught by her, that is your choice. But do not dare to speak for the rest of us." Beatrice Miller, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, stared at Clara with pure venom before turning on her heel and storming out, her two companions scurrying behind her. Clara stood in the quiet hall, her heart beating a strong and steady rhythm. She had not raised her voice. She had not pleaded. She had simply stood her ground in her own light, and she had not been moved. Eli did not speak of marriage. He was not a man of pretty words or grand pronouncements. His love was a language of action, of quiet, steady work. That spring, he began to spend his evenings, and the one day a week he had off from the mill at a small, unclaimed plot of land at the very edge of town. It overlooked the valley, with the vast, silent mountains rising up behind it. At first, Clara did not know what he was doing. She would watch from a distance as he cleared the land, his axe swinging in a powerful, hypnotic arc. He dug foundations and split logs with a singular, driving focus. Then, slowly, a structure began to rise from the earth. Walls went up, a roof was framed, and the unmistakable shape of a small, sturdy house took form. He was building them a home. It was his proposal, his promise, his vow, all written in sweat and timber and nails. It was the most beautiful poem she had ever known. She would bring him his dinner in the evenings, and they would sit together on a pile of fresh-cut lumber, watching the sun set over the valley, the scent of sawdust and their future mingling in the air. One afternoon, as the house was nearing completion, Clara was sorting through the few meager possessions she owned. At the bottom of her small bag, her fingers closed around the familiar, worn edges of the torn photograph. She pulled it out and looked at the faded image of her son, Elijah James, a sweet, painful ghost from a lifetime ago. For months, this small piece of paper had been her only link to a past that defined her, a past of love and devastating loss. She walked out of the boarding house and to the new home Eli was building. Beside the house, a wild plum tree was in full, glorious bloom, its white blossoms a riot of life against the blue sky. With her bare hands, she dug a small hole in the soft earth at the base of the tree. She held the photograph for a long moment, her thumb tracing the name on the back one last time. "Goodbye, my sweet boy," she whispered, tears blurring the image. "Goodbye, Samuel." She was not saying goodbye to the love she held for them. That would be a part of her forever. She was saying goodbye to the woman who was only their widow, the woman defined only by her grief. She was letting her go, planting her in the earth so that someone new could continue to grow. She placed the photograph in the hole and covered it with soil, her tears watering the ground. That evening, as they stood on the porch of their nearly finished house, a cool wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. The house was small, just 2 rooms, but it was theirs. It was a testament to survival, a monument to a love that had been forged in the harshest of winters. Clara leaned her head against Eli's strong shoulder, his arm wrapping securely around her. She felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. She thought of the terrified, freezing woman who had begged him for a mercy she did not believe she deserved. She looked at the quiet, steady man beside her, the man who had answered her prayer. She turned to him, her eyes shining in the twilight. The words came out as a soft, trusting whisper, no longer a plea, but a vow of her own. "Don't leave me broken again." He held her tighter, his rough cheek pressing against her hair. He looked out at the vast Wyoming landscape, at the endless sky above them. His voice, when he answered, was a solemn, unbreakable promise. "I won't," he said. "I never will." The story ends as they turned and walked together through the open doorway of their small house, weathered by life, but finally, miraculously, whole, while the Wyoming wind howled through the silent, watching hills, no longer sounding cruel, but like a song of homecoming. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.